Hello, society, and thank you for joining The Social Solution with Maya Brown, where we will discuss recent social injustices and relate them to the current news. If you have a passion for social justice and want to stay informed of society, then this is the podcast for you. Remember that if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. These are the echoes of protesters in Nigeria, organizing against police brutality. As peaceful protests are occurring, they are being met with even more police brutality. The same colonial history that impacts Black Americans here in the United States is the same colonial history that's killing Nigerians today. Policing and the system of government is colonial and systemic. Despite the growing violence, Nigerian protesters demanding an end to SARS defied a curfew and faced off with security forces on October 20th. Gunfire rang out and fires burned in Lagos. Security forces then opened fire without warning into a crowd of demonstrators singing the country's national anthem, and at least a dozen protesters in Lagos were shot and killed. SARS is a special branch of the Nigeria Police and stands for the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, and has a long history of abuse towards its citizens. They are responsible for widespread torture and other cruel or degrading treatment or punishment of detainees in their custody. Activists and protesters are now demanding change and to finally end SARS.
End SARS. People around the world, especially in Nigeria, are still victims of police brutality today.
More recently, the Nigerian government has pledged to end SARS and reform the police. However, it isn't the first time they've made this promise. The End SARS campaign was launched in 2017, but has recently been trending on social media as Nigerians want an end to its long violent harassment, brutality, extrajudicial killings, and extortion. Over the years, Nigerian protesters have been tear-gassed and repressed by police, while the government does nothing to hold SARS accountable and finally put an end to the branch. I spoke with Ambassador John Campbell, a senior fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He is also the author of the upcoming book, Nigeria and the Nation-State, Rethinking Diplomacy with the Post-Colonial World, which is set for publication in December 2020. Campbell explained that SARS was created back in 1984 in response to a wave of armed robberies. The SARS unit was officially commissioned in Lagos.
At the time, the inability of the regular police to respond became a political liability. SARS and its negative reputation is particularly to be found in the south of the country, particularly in Lagos.
SARS has been accused of targeting people who may appear well-dressed, shaking them down for money, and torturing and abusing, and even killing those who resist.
They were often carrying cell phones, sometimes laptops, and as a demographic, they had been subject to SARS and other police efforts to shake them down. Police in Nigeria in general are widely hated. SARS police even more so.
In October 2005, a SARS operative killed a bus driver for failing to pay a bribe. In 2010, a SARS officer shot a 15-year-old boy at his high school, which ended up killing him. According to the SARS officer, the teen was mistaken for a kidnapper. In August 2019, 4 SARS operatives were arrested and charged with murder after being caught on film, manhandling, and then shooting to death 2 suspected phone thieves in broad daylight. Now, these are just a few examples of many incidents. In October 2020, a SARS police officer shot a young Nigerian man. Amnesty International reports more than 82 cases of abuse and extrajudicial killings by SARS officers from January 2017 to May 2020.
The accusations are perfectly true. Well, what was really interesting about the SARS demonstration is it started out as a relatively young middle-class movement, strongly influenced by the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the United States. All kinds of parallels were drawn between the behavior of the American police under certain circumstances and the behavior of the Nigerian police. But as the demonstrations went on, they changed. And increasingly, the focus shifted from police brutality to demonstrations against Nigeria's political economy in general. Bad governance, lack of transparency, lack of responsiveness to its citizens.
Campbell noted that the government of Nigeria has a similar setup to that of the United States.
Well, if you look at a formal description of it, it looks a little bit like our own. Separation of powers, federal system, independent judiciary. That's not the reality at all. The reality is that the government is highly centralized in the person of the president. Compared to the U.S. Congress, the Nigerian National Assembly is relatively weak, and the executive has disproportionate influence over the judiciary. So think of it as a relatively centralized system with regular elections that is moving towards democracy conducted according to the rule of law, but it isn't there yet.
The protests and demand for an end to SARS can also be compared to the protests here in the U.S. and the demand for racial justice.
The Black Lives Matter demonstrations made a huge impact on Nigerians. Knowledge of police killing of African American men was very widespread in Nigeria. And as I say, it struck a chord. At the height of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations here, I heard one Nigerian woman say in Nigeria something along the lines of, Black Lives Matter? Here in Nigeria, no lives matter.
The similarities don't just stop there. Colonialism is rooted into Nigeria just as it is here in the United States.
Many Nigerians will argue that Nigeria remains a colonial state, that the only difference is that the British left and were replaced by an indigenous elite that in many respects is worse. The police were established under the British not to serve the public, but to protect the regime. And they still do. That's the way they see their role. Hence, the policeman most definitely is not your friend in Nigeria.
Now, turning to democracy, it is often described as, quote, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and is anchored on the rule of the Constitution, which guarantees certain fundamental rights. Nigerian authorities, however, appear to be on a renewed drive to muzzle free speech. Campbell says it's part of Nigeria's want for self-censorship.
Even during the years of military government, Nigerians were quite outspoken. Freedom of speech is very real. So what the military were aiming for is what all authoritarian governments want, and that is self-censorship. It's not like the old Soviet Union, or for that matter, it's not like China now.
Protests in Nigeria have taken various forms, but they haven't been as popular as they are here in the U.S.
There are not very many of them. The last major protests occurred in 2012. The reason for that is that the Nigerian population is highly fractured. At least 350 different ethnic groups, each with their own language, roughly equally divided between Christians and Muslims, a relatively low level of identification with the Nigerian state. Only about 17% of Nigerians define themselves as Nigerian. Um, so protests are relatively hard to bring about.
When there were protests, Campbell said that they weren't met with peace. The same can be seen today. On October 20th, protesters were met with excessive force, including live rounds and water cannons.
With a great deal of skill by the government. A mixture of buying off, paying bribes, and arrests. Carrot and stick.
Carrot and stick is a metaphor for the use of a combination of reward and punishment to induce a desired behavior. This kind of ideology allows for the way that protesters are being treated in Nigeria. Can there be reform?
There can be some reform of the police, and the government has promised to abolish SARS. The question, of course, everyone is watching is whether it simply reconstitutes it under a different name. Point is, Nigeria is an immensely complicated place. The issues are very deep and extraordinarily complex, and it is not a situation in which you can wave a magic wand. No such magic wands exist outside of Harry Potter.
So now we must ask, is there anything that can be done to give the protesters what they want, or will this brutality and injustice continue to happen?
Nigeria was once the most important partner of the United States on African issues of mutual concern. It can't fulfill that role now. It is to be hoped that in the future it will be able to.
I also spoke with 20-year-old Irene Okyere, whose roots stem from Nigeria.
My name is Irene Okyere. I am currently a junior at Stony Brook University. I am the head PRO, head public relations officer for the African Student Union on campus, and I am also Ghanaian and Nigerian, so it kind of helps being able to talk about this whole situation because it relates to me and it like touches me. It touches home for me.
Jumping into it, when you first saw what was happening in Nigeria, how did you primarily feel?
Definitely. I mean, I feel like anyone without even having to fully understand what was going on would feel disheartened about it, you know, especially since the whole point was that it was youth being assaulted. So the whole premise of it, which I'm sure you guys will probably hear already, is that the youth are being assaulted and harassed by the people put in positions to protect them, you know. And so to hear that that's going on in Nigeria, just like it has been here with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's very disheartening because it's like, why do we have to keep fighting for basic things like human rights, you know? And so it was also scary knowing that I have people back home. Like I have my godmother, cousins that are back home, and I'm like hoping they're okay. And I'm sure they are because they aren't around it, but like they're closer to it than I am. And so just to know that is also very heartbreaking.
Right, it's a scary feeling.
Yeah, it's very scary. Yeah, it is.
And I know you mentioned like the Black Lives Matter movement that happened here. So would you compare the protests in Nigeria to the ongoing protests that are happening here?
For sure. I think with any protest, you can compare them because the government uses the same tactics, which is crazy. So with the protests in Nigeria and with the Black Lives Movement protest, one main thing government do is they try to suppress the people's voice, you know. And so when the protests start, and then there are those who are looting, which happened in both Nigeria and with the protests here, the government used that as like a tactic to say, oh, what they're doing isn't beneficial for anyone. And I think that's something that's compared for both Nigeria and Black Lives Matter. And another thing is just government not wanting to take responsibility, not wanting to step forward and say, we support what they're doing and we understand what they're doing, but rather they look at the negative side of things, which is the looting, and say, oh no, they need to stop. We need to stop them, you know. So I think with any protest, you can definitely compare those two things because the government always try to suppress the people. And that's the worst part of it.
Yeah, basically they're fighting, the protesters are basically fighting against police brutality, and the police are kind of fighting it with more police brutality.
Exactly. And it's kind of like, you see what we're talking about, and then the government's like, no, we don't.
Right.
But it's like, you're showing us that we're right, and you're showing us that we have a reason to fight. because you keep just bringing out the forces and you keep bringing out the power to fight against us when we're simply trying to protest peacefully, you know.
Hmm.
So
Do you
it
think
sucks.
that, no, yeah, for sure. And I guess based on that, do you think that the protesters in Nigeria have a reason to be angry?
Most definitely. Oh, for sure. Because when you think about it, it's like, why do I have police harassing me because I'm holding an iPhone, or I have on jewelry, or I have on good clothes, and you use that as a reason to assault me, you know? And it's like, it's been going on for a while, but the people have to decide, oh, it's time to stand up for this, because if we don't, it's gonna keep going on. We can't just sit on our hands and let them continuously come and harass us for simple things such as
Right.
how we look. And so I think for sure they have a reason, for sure. Like no doubt about it.
Hmm. And what would you do if you were in their place?
Um, I think that's easy to answer because similar things were happening with the Black Lives Movement.
Hmm.
So if I could, like if my mom allowed me, I would join with the protests, because it's like that's the best way to show your support, to be there with everything that's happening, to be in the midst of the action. But other than that, just showing support through social media. Everyone's on social media. That's the best thing you can do if you cannot be on the front lines. Just continue to repost what you see, share and talk about it with your friends and family, so the news spreads. So then it's just a cycle of information, and everyone gets to be aware of what's going on. So
Yeah.
definitely just sharing information. If I was there, I would be on the front lines helping whatever way I could, donating, just sharing. I think sharing is the most important part, especially for whoever can't be there.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like a lot of times if you just stay silent, it's not gonna
That's the
help
worst part. Oh, that's the worst part. That's the worst part for sure.
with.
Even if it's just a simple post without any words on it, at least your followers will see it.
Click
And you
on it,
might have a
right?
follower who would then click on it exactly and go forward with the donating or also resharing. So
Mhm.
it's just a cycle of you post, then two people post, and then just goes on like that.
Right,
So for sure, silence is not the option at all. At
exactly.
all. Mhm.
And do you think that there are broader issues at play? I know that they're basically fighting against police brutality, but are there
Mhm.
other issues that you feel that they're basically trying to get rid of?
Um. hmm. I think looking past police brutality will just be government accountability. You know, they're not asking just for NSARS to be banned. They're asking for government to stand up, and when they see things like this happening, to take action. Because I'm not sure if people are aware, but in the recent news broadcasting that's going on with the speeches from government officials and the president, they don't even address what's going on. They don't address the killings that happened with the massacre just a few weeks ago. They just try to look over it. And it's like it goes past police brutality when the government isn't speaking up. So I think they're just fighting for basic human rights and saying you have to protect us. That's what you're in position to do. You're
Hmm.
in position to make the laws that are gonna stand up for us.
Right.
So I think it's definitely way past police brutality and more of like a just basic human rights. Like we deserve to live. Like, why do I have to fight for that simple right to live? You
Exactly.
Yeah.
And my last question for you is, do you think that this situation in Nigeria is getting enough attention here in the US?
I think it was early on when it first started, but just like the Black Lives Matter movement, there are times where it dulls down, and like
Right.
I don't know for what reason, but it does dull down. And like people's social media goes back to normal, and their feed goes back to normal, so they don't see as much of the things anymore. And I guess because you don't see it, you don't post it. But in the beginning, I would say it definitely did. But now we have to work to make sure that we aren't forgetting about it, because it didn't stop happening. People just stopped posting about it. People just stopped talking about it. And so I think it did get the support, and some celebrities are speaking up. Here, back home, government officials are trying to speak up. They're not doing their best, but they tried. So I think it did in the beginning, but it kind of dulled down, which sucks. But I think it's also going to pick up again.
Okay. And then do you have anything else to add?
Just overall, I think whether we are here, like in the United States, or people who are back home, I think everyone has to come together and stand together, because it's very common for people to say, oh, well, I'm not there, so why should I, do anything? Or even Blacks or African Americans who say, well, that's an African problem, or I'm not African, so why should I support, or why should I do this and that? And I feel like it goes past that. It goes past the political issue. It goes past the racial issue. It's just a human rights issue, like I was saying earlier. So I think, just to conclude, everyone just needs to stand up together when we see things like this happening. It's important that we band together, because if we don't, change can happen on its own. And so, especially when we see it being a global thing, where it's not just even Nigeria, it's just Cameroon and Guinea, and it's like,
Yeah,
when
it's
you see
everywhere.
it getting so bad, you have to speak up, because then it shows that it's not just a one place thing, not just a one people thing. It's like a world thing, and
Right.
it's like I feel like people need to understand. People need to educate themselves, inform themselves. That's the best thing we can do, but just be armed with information.
We heard from an expert and from one who views Nigeria as a home. People want their basic human rights, and the government shouldn't be able to get away with everything that they're doing. People are dead and dying only because they were peacefully protesting.
What do we want? And when do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we?
The Nigerian government announced that SARS will be replaced with a new police unit, SWAT, or in other words, the Special Weapons and Tactics Unit. I think that it's just a change of name and acronym because the problem is within the system. Police brutality doesn't end by simply putting a new band-aid over the wound. It ends by making sure there are no more new wounds. A social solution to ending SARS and completely getting rid of the belief behind it is to spread awareness, be an ally, and continue to use your voice. Otherwise, these issues will continue and continue to happen, again and again. Thank you for joining The Social Solution with Maya Brown. And thank you, Irene and Mr. Campbell, for joining me today. Make sure you listen to the next episode. This is Maya Brown, and remember that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.